Borrowed power is a term for abilities that you do not get from simply leveling up, and have a shelf life where eventually you'll lose those powers. Sometimes you lose them after a single raid tier, other times it takes a whole expansion before they go away, but whatever the case, you know they're temporary, and they also increase the power level of your character. In the World of Warcraft community, borrowed power is usually used as a derogatory term when describing any new system or features that are being announced. And you can't really blame them when you look at the history of how poorly major borrowed power systems have been implemented. But borrowed power inherently is pretty fun, and should not be a cause of dread if a new feature announced happens to have some form of borrowed power in it. When it comes to borrowed power in World of Warcraft, there's actually a very long history of different forms of them. One of the longest lasting ones is simply gear. Gear that has higher stats makes your character stronger, but you replace that with stronger gear during the next patch or expansion. There's also a glyph system that existed for a few expansions, which allowed you to modify a couple of your abilities. Glyphs were rather simple to customize as you could just buy them off the auction house, and for a time when you had a glyph, you had the powers forever. As we get to Mists of Pandaria, they experimented with a whole bunch of different minor power gains that you accumulated over the course of the expansion, in the form of the Legendary Cloak questline, which eventually gave you a Legendary Cloak with a special ability on it, Legendary Metagems that gave you a really powerful buff, and even shot-touched weapons at the beginning of the expansion, which they kind of abandoned. In Warlords of Draenor, they had a very simple system of Draenor perks, which you got by just leveling up normally and kept for the entire expansion without any other kind of fuss. With the intentions, they were obviously temporary, because they were called Draenor perks, in addition to a legendary ring that gave you a Bloodlust-like ability at the end of the expansion. Then in Legion, we got one of the biggest systems of borrowed power, the Legion Legendaries, and also the Artifact Weapon. Both of these things vastly increased the power level of your character, and required all kinds of grinding in order to obtain. There was so much grinding in fact that Blizzard tried to alleviate some of this with their next system, the Azerite pieces, which required just as much grinding, while providing less power upgrades. Then there was the Essence system, Corruptions, and finally Shadowlands with their Soulbinds, Conduits, and Covenant abilities. Right up until Legion, the borrowed power systems were kind of accepted, and didn't really draw too much ire from the community. So, what exactly was the main difference before that point? Tier set bonuses are a form of borrowed power that everybody loves, yet Azerite pieces of equipment are universally hated, despite the fact they kind of do the same thing. Let's take a look at another video game, the Metroid series. In this game, you go around and explore in order to gather powerful upgrades, which allow you to progress past new stages or defeat certain bosses, which are unkillable without a certain upgrade. And at the start of the game, you're incredibly weak as a base character. But by the end of the game, you're literally jumping through enemies as they explode by just touching you. The power increase is massive, which is fine for a single player game. But the game series also tells a continuous story with the same character going to new locations in a different game. And every time you go to a new location, they have to explain why you don't have your godlike powers anymore at the start of your new location. And there's a different explanation for literally every single game. Sometimes you get into an accident which just absorbs everything, and sometimes you simply get stranded in a place without any of your upgrades equipped. Whatever the case, they make you go through the game in order to find everything again. And a majority of the time, you're getting a lot of the same abilities that you've already obtained in previous games. And the gameplay for this is pretty fun, and spawned a successful franchise and even a video game genre, where there's a term for a type of game like this called Metroidvania, because Castlevania does a similar thing with their games. And a lot of the Metroidvania games just to have characters go through the game, slowly acquiring powerful upgrades, that way they can become godlike characters towards the end. And it's the contrast of starting out weak and then eventually becoming powerful that makes those games really fun. If you start off the game with all of your powers from the very beginning, then you kind of just steamroll through everything, which doesn't really present a real challenge, and a lot of the fun in video games is overcoming those challenges, as seen by the success and the popularity of FromSoft games, which are notoriously difficult. But when you're able to go back to the starting zone with your max level character with all those powerful upgrades from the endgame and blow through everything, it feels a lot more earned, rather than if you just started like that from the start. And World of Warcraft also has power climbs like this. When you start off in a new expansion, you start doing daily quests or world quests, it actually takes you a bit of time in order to accomplish them with a fresh character. But as soon as you clear the newest raid and get a full set of equipment, and you go back and do those same daily or world quests again, you can blast through them way quicker than normal. And a lot of people don't want to admit this, but being able to do your world quests faster because of better gear is an enjoyable part of getting gear in the first place, especially for casual players. There are some people who will pay for boosts just so they can solo farm easier with better gear. And obviously you can go into low-level zones and destroy low-level mobs with one hit, but it doesn't really have the same impact as doing that in a Metroid game. There is a really big difference between a Metroid game though and an MMO like World of Warcraft when it comes to these borrowed powers. And the amount of time it takes you to level a new character in a new expansion from 50 to 60, you could have beaten a whole Metroid game in that exact same time frame. The amount of time it takes you to beat a Metroid game is around under 4 hours, and under 2 hours if you speedrun it. The amount of time it takes to level a new character to max level in a new expansion is way more than that. And when you finally get to max level, you're barely at the start of your grind, rather than already being a godlike character. Which is why everybody is fine with Metroid games resetting your character's progress every game, because you get really great upgrades pretty frequently, and you almost never stay without a new upgrade after over an hour of play. Whereas you could play for days at a time in World of Warcraft every day and not receive a single upgrade. This is likely where a lot of frustration stems when it comes to borrowed power. When it comes to raid drop legendaries, trinkets, and tier set bonuses, everybody usually likes these things, but when it comes to Azerite gear, corruptions, or covenant abilities, they're met with widespread hate and derision, and we can kind of draw a parallel between why people like some forms of borrowed power and why people probably don't like others. If we take a look at raid drop legendaries, trinkets, and tier set bonuses, a lot of these are just random drops from bosses and raids, and you can get lucky and get a full set of them within the first week of a new raid dropping. If you take a look at a graph of Azerite gear, corruptions, or soulbinds, and the amount of time it takes to get those to an appropriate level that's usable, there is a huge disparity of just time versus effort. If you get the Sylvanas bow, or you got the Blades of Azeroth, you were pretty much good to go. If you got Deathbringer's Will from ICC and Wrath of the Lich King, you got a huge, ridiculous power increase from just killing a boss. When you finally get your 4-set bonus, your damage would definitely pop off. But when you got an Azerite piece, you might not even be able to use it yet. You might have to wait for weeks in order for the Azerite research to come up to a point where you'd be able to unlock the final ring of it, and then you'd finally be able to use that piece of equipment. When you got corruptions, you'd only be able to use a single one because you had to wait for your corruption resistance to increase gradually over time with no way to decrease the timers. And also, you had to get lucky that you even got the right corruption that you wanted, because there was an extra layer of RNG on top of the RNG, until they added in a vendor, which allowed you to maybe buy the one you wanted if you stayed up for weeks, and of course the vendor was actually carrying the one you wanted. And for soulbinds, you just had to wait until the artificial time gate was up for you to finally have the max level of it, and get the full potential out of your new covenant abilities, which overall provided a pretty minor power boost. If we look at a graph of pieces of power upgrades that people like, compared to one that people's dislike based on time required to obtain, it's pretty obvious to see the difference between them, despite the fact they both give around the same amount of power increases. The amount of time required to get one is just vastly higher than getting the others, and the amount of time it takes to get a power increase drastically lowers the likability of said power increase. What if I were to tell you that Azerite gear is actually better than tier set bonuses? A tier set bonus gives you 2 power increases based on the 2-set and 4-set. You don't get to pick what those increases are, you just have to get lucky that the devs happen to give you a good one for that expansion. But with Azerite gear, you get to pick what bonuses you want, instead of leaving it up to the random whims of the devs, where you get to pick a choice of random whims of the devs, and these choices give you about the same amount of power increases as the tier set bonuses anyway. And allows you to even customize it further by stacking the ones you like, or mix and matching a whole bunch of minor benefits that might improve how you play your class. Then you also get a couple of other minor benefits too, like a little bit of extra healing, a little bit of extra movement speed, or maybe even a small upgrade to some of your minor baseline abilities. When it comes to the amount of powers you get from Azerite gear, when compared to a tier set bonus, being able to choose which of your minor bonuses from a piece of equipment is better than not having a choice at all. However, the acquisition of Azerite gear was 10 times worse than tier set bonuses, and required getting a whole bunch of pieces of equipment to maybe get the Azerite gear you wanted, which had the traits that you wanted to pick from, since each piece of Azerite gear only lets you choose from a very small handful of traits, rather than having all of them available as an option. And then when a new raid came out, you wouldn't even be able to use all those traits, and you had to go grind out more Azerite power. And to top it all off, it took just as much time to get one Azerite piece as a piece of tier gear. Azerite gear is just a really good example of how not to add a borrowed power system, because everything was there for it to be a better replacement to tier gear, but instead they had to make it incredibly tedious for no reason. And because it was added in so badly, you were just mad they had to deal with this new system instead of just getting tier set bonuses like normal. When it comes to corruptions, a system that was added at the very end of Battle for Azeroth, which probably had one of the biggest power climbs in player power in the game's history, personally, I was a big fan of the overall idea of corruptions. They were basically enchants for gear that gave you procs that could do more damage in your baseline abilities or vastly increase the power level of your base class. Some of them would give you ridiculous amounts of haste, others would lower the cooldowns of your abilities by 200%, and others which spawned giant laser beams from the sky that would scale based on how much health you had. And being able to customize how you wanted your character to be broken was such an interesting idea in theory, that I implemented a system of this into one of my Dungeons & Dragons games. However, I can assure you that I did not implement how you obtained corruptions into the game, because it, just like Azerite, was terrible. Most corruptions had 3 different tiers to them, and each piece of gear could have a chance to have a random piece of corruption on it. And if you managed to get the one you wanted, you kind of hoped you had the highest available tier of that corruption, otherwise you're kind of just wasting a piece of equipment with that corruption on it. And when they finally added a vendor that allowed you to target specific pieces of corruptions, they didn't let you pick from all the corruption pieces on the vendor, and instead had a random rotation that changed out a few times a week. You had to wait around for a chance to buy the corruption that you wanted, and also that made the corruptions that were good incredibly expensive. So you couldn't buy everything you needed the first time the vendor had the stuff you wanted, and still had to wait a couple of weeks. And if you want to talk about poorly implemented borrowed power systems, we have to look at Legion for the absolute worst. Legion was the first expansion that started with a more in-your-face borrowed power system, with the artifacts and Legion Legendaries. The artifacts were fine in my opinion. They had a system of endless grinding that could increase your power level further, but there wasn't really inherent randomness to it, because you just kinda got what you got. But the Legion Legendaries were awful. The Legion Legendaries were modeled very heavily based on Diablo 3's legendary system, where sometimes a legendary can completely change your playstyle or is necessary in order to complete a build. Whereas Diablo has a seasonal gameplay mode and allows you to gain these legendaries much quicker, you can pretty much get all legendaries needed within your first day of playing a season. Whereas for World of Warcraft, legendaries didn't have the same gracious drop chance. The first 4 legendaries you got had a much higher chance to drop than everything else, but could still take about a month of casual playtime before you saw your first 4 legendaries. And World First Raiders would create multiple copies of their class of choice to farm out the first 4 legendaries, just to get a higher chance of obtaining the ones that they were targeting, as some of the legendaries were so ridiculously powerful and broken that it could almost double the amount of damage you do, or allow you to one-shot groups of enemy players in the open world. So you really wanted to target specific legendaries. In Diablo, they don't really allow you to target specific legendaries either, but there's plenty of different ways in order to increase the chances that you get a specific one, and unless you're terribly unlucky, you'll have all the legendaries you need within the first couple of days. In World of Warcraft, it was possible to go to the end of the raid tier without getting the one legendary you needed, because the drop chance was just so low, and there was absolutely no way to target the legendaries you wanted. The powers tied to the legendaries were amazing. The acquisition of it was probably the worst one we've ever seen, and it kinda puts corruption to shame. If there was an award for the worst implemented acquisition system of a borrowed power, I can't think of anything that beats Legion Legendaries. At the end of the expansion, they finally added a vendor to buy them, but at that point it was a little bit too late because most people who played the whole expansion had already gotten all the legendaries by that point. So you may be thinking at this point, YouTuber person, everything you're talking about makes it seem as if borrowed power is terrible. If Blizzard messes it up every time they try to put one in, doesn't that mean it's actually just a bad design system overall? And to that, I say, maybe. Maybe Blizzard really just doesn't know how to actually add fun borrowed power systems to the game. And maybe they should just leave it on gear only. Although, if we look at one of the expansions with 2 of the worst implemented borrowed power systems, we also randomly have one of the best as well. And of course, what I'm talking about is Battle for Azeroth with its Essence system. With Essences, you got around 10 different abilities you could pick from in order to use as your active ability, and then you also had 3 slots in order to use the passives of other abilities, so you got to pick and choose which active abilities you were using and which passive abilities you were using, and you got to change that out whenever you wanted in any kind of rest area. And acquiring all the abilities in your Heart of Azeroth could be done within the first week or 2 of the system dropping. And if you want to grind out even further in order to increase the power level of them, you could, which was definitely necessary in order to reach rank 3. But if you wanted to go even further beyond, you got a nice cosmetic upgrade that just made the abilities look cooler without adding any kind of actual power increase. And as we've seen by the success of the Mage Tower, adding a hard grind that only has a cosmetic reward is definitely the way to go. There were a lot of people who tried to get the rank 4 of their essences, even though it wasn't necessary in the slightest. If we contrast that to the Shadowlands Covenants, they only allowed you to pick from 1 of 4 abilities, and you were heavily disincentivized from changing your choice. whereas the Essence system allows you to pick from one of 10 abilities and was designed with the intention that you'd be changing them out all the time. Now, there were some problems with the Essence system as well, but for the most part, it's one of the best modern power systems they've ever added to the game. And it's a shame they just kind of ignored it and its lessons when going into the new expansion. So, if we go back and look at all of the borrowed power systems that players enjoyed, or had the least amount of pushback by the community as a whole, nearly all of them share the common sentimentality, where they are easy to grind out, or gave you lots of customization, and the best had both of them. With only one exception in the artifact weapon, which was actually very well liked despite being a big grind and having no power customizations, but was chock full of cosmetic customizations. And nearly all of the ones that are universally hated either required too much grinding in order to acquire, took months in order to unlock, or heavily restricted how you could customize your abilities, i.e. Covenant locks and conduit energy. Now, you may be thinking, Mr. YouTuber person, since Blizzard rarely gets it right with modern power systems, shouldn't they just go back to pre-Legion days where there were no temporary power systems added to the game, when the game was actually good? Blizzard has actually been adding temporary powers to the game for a long time. They just used to go about it differently. At the start of every new expansion, Blizzard would add a couple of new abilities to every class, and sometimes give them brand new talents. Then, with the new expansion, they would quietly just remove some of the abilities they didn't like anymore. And since there was a whole bunch of new stuff added every expansion, there wasn't too much fuss about it. Well, kind of. People complained forever about Eyes of the Beast being removed at the start of Cataclysm, and a whole bunch of other minor abilities. But, when it came to Blizzard wanting to give people new abilities, they would just kind of do it without any fuss about how you obtain those things, and since you got them all by default while just leveling in the new expansion, people were just happy to get new stuff to play around with. In fact, that was one of the biggest appeals of a new expansion, getting new abilities to play with. With the Shadowlands borrowed power system, all players got 4 new abilities to play around with, which is way more than was added in older expansions, where they randomly would give players 2 or 3 new things total, where you'd be lucky if even one of them was actually usable ability in your rotation. Which is why I'm pretty confident that the Blizzard added 4 new Covenant abilities to the classes and let you change them out interchangeably whenever you wanted, people would have been pretty happy about it, because they've been historically happy about getting worse things in previous expansions. Some people might not remember this, but Symbiosis was a really game-changing ability that was added to Druids for one expansion, and then quickly removed after that expansion because it was too much of a headache to balance. And that was during Mists of Pandaria, before we had the modern borrow power systems that only exist for an expansion. So for all intents and purposes, Symbiosis was basically like a Covenant ability, which they let Druids play around with for one expansion before removing after that borrowed power time limit was over. So, why does the WoW community hate borrowed power so much nowadays? For the last 3 expansions, Blizzard has had systems of borrowed power that required you to put a lot more time and effort into the game than in previous expansions. And a lot of those new systems were added in incredibly poorly, almost in a way that was specifically designed just to waste your time, or reward players that had nothing but free time on their hands. And when Blizzard added a new talent to the game in previous expansions, there wasn't really an advantage you can get over someone else with those new talents, as you just kind of got them by default. But it also meant there wasn't really anything for you to do once you got those abilities, and Blizzard definitely wants to keep or add small power increases to the game, because gradually increasing the power level of your character is kind of fun. RuneScape, another popular MMO, one of the originals even, was built around the entire premise of constant progression. Literally every single thing you do grows your character, from fishing the weakest fish to gathering the most rare herbs, which makes a game that lets you do whatever you want at the moment, however you wish to do it, and get stronger by doing that activity of choice. While there is no borrowed power within the game, it does add new abilities once in a while, and these abilities take tens of thousands of hours to max out. And this is one of the main appeals of the game, just constant power progression past leveling to max level. And the only real way to do it in WoW in previous expansions was through gear and gear alone. So Blizzard tried to add this near infinite progression system to the new borrowed powers of the expansion. It kind of failed, and definitely soured the name of the borrowed powers in the process, because a lot of the actual borrowed powers themselves were a lot of fun to play around with. If they had the system to buy Legion Legendaries at the start of the expansion, if they had a corruption vendor with all of the corruptions on it for non-exorbitant prices at the start of the patch, if they had Azerite pieces of equipment that gave you an option to choose all of the Azerite traits instead of just 2, if the artifact weapon had an AP cap at the start of the expansion rather than a pseudo-unobtainable one, if they allowed you to change out your 4 Covenant abilities at will, then all of these systems would have been much more well-liked without them having to change anything about the actual powers themselves. The borrowed power is not the problem, It's how you obtain those powers that is.